All right, a bit of a re-recording here because we lost audio in the last archetyping video, last 20 minutes, kind of the bulk of it. The other video, if you watch up to 40 minutes and 35 seconds, you're going to have the context of how we identify the different archetypes and how to begin planning your sessions. But this is going to be the meat and the potatoes in terms of how we're going to actually build out sessions. So, you'll see all this in the other video. Examples: muscular, elastic, and hybrid. How to bucket, different methods of how to bucket. And then we get to this part. So applying it in a team environment, which I've come to realize is probably the chief prospect of applying the archetyping methodology, is this ability to use it amongst groups and teams. So you can use it amongst smaller groups. Typically probably group sizes of 6 or more, 10 or more. But it's really effective amongst larger teams. Usually we have a high coach to player ratio, so this is going to be particularly effective. Something I continue to preach is the effectiveness of resource management, and we're going to talk about that in close detail with examples here now. So, like I just mentioned, primary benefit utilizing these guidelines is the freedom it provides athletes. All right. Um, you're going to notice when we start putting archetype specific or archetype related athletes together, you're going to see an uptick in engagement in competition, right? So if you have an elastic athlete, you put them with a muscular athlete, you ask them to squat full range, heavy back squat. First of all, there's going to be a large disparity amongst their max lifts, force capacity. So that already there's a level of discomfort, right? And then there's not going to have as much drive of competition if you're not kind of near the same level. One might really like back squatting and be all gung ho and be like, oh, let's go, let's load this up, while the other one might have no interest in it whatsoever. So, and then you get this disparity of engagement. However, you put an elastic with an elastic, relatively same level capacity, they start competing together, right? They try to go one for one. Oh, well, he did this at that, I'm going to try and do it, right? So that's just the idea behind the freedom it provides athletes. And we're going to talk about a bit about this, but because there's a psychological component associated with the different archetypes, when we give them the choice, we want them to do a bilateral squatting pattern, but we give them choice. They're going to self-select something that they're going to push themselves, and maybe something they're a bit better at, but we can get a higher ROI on it than if we were to force them to do something they don't particularly like. Right? The ease in alterations in programming. This is we now have a bucket of athletes and their response to particular exercise prescriptions and stimuli. So now we have multiple ways to attack the same situation. And then the general engagement and competition I've already talked about. So key points of consideration, and these are kind of key points of consideration that go across the board with all programming, in my opinion. General hierarchy, if you will. But the key points are sport demands and needs. This is going to set the foundation of what we're trying to, the physical qualities we're trying to associate with and amplify, the inherent strengths and weaknesses that come with specific sports. Team global needs, you'll get this after your team wide testing. You're going to see, okay, we're particularly weak in this area. Um, then athlete archetype, this division happens through your testing. It's going to determine the type of exercises we can use, need to be using, and dependent on the following things: being season phase, so how much load intensity and frequency we can actually put on them, what their schedule like, game density, practice density, stuff like that. Group needs and strengths, that comes from the archetyping. If we're early in season and we're working predominantly on strengths, we're going to allocate a few more exercise volume and intensity on the strengths of the particular archetype. Day of the week, how far are we from competition, since competition, or to competition, right? And then session goal. Ultimately, what is the main goal of the session? High CNS, high tissue, max V, who knows, right? So to give you some context and an example here, sport demands and needs, working with a U18 hockey player, a group of hockey players, about 25 of them. They're male with a pretty good training tenure, been training routinely in a gym for 3 to 4 years. Team global needs, lower limb max force capacity. They're relatively weak in a bilateral squatting pattern and have express the same thing through isometric mid-thigh pull and in their general jumping capacity, with a particular emphasis on eccentric RFD, seeing that they lack the ability to rapidly decelerate. Athlete archetype, working with all three. Season phase is going to be early in season. The group needs and strengths, we have a division of 40% needs, 60% strengths, as we've just come off the off season where we put a particular emphasis on the strengths. Day of the week, it's a Monday, 2 days post game, leaving us 3 to 4 days before the next competition. Then the session goal, it's going to be a high CNS day. We're still early in the season. We can put a little extra stress on them. We're going to have a lower bilateral focus with supplemental work in the upper body, being horizontal push and vertical pull. All right, so that's just to give you the context. So this is our global context of what the session should look for each archetype, but now we're going to plug in exercises with respect to what they need. So some of you might have seen this through some of my posts. Okay, maybe you came here because of this post. But this is how we can plan out one session, 3 different tracks under the same roof. Everyone's accomplishing the same thing. So the way I like to divide up my programs, we always have some form of force expression component at the beginning, right? Whether it's plyometric, ballistic, jumps, hops, sort of stuff, even some low microdosing of acceleration work. Green's going to be associated with work-ons. Red's going to be associated with strengths. Okay, and we're going to work through it all. So from a force expression component, muscular. So reminder on our predisposition in the muscular archetype. Muscular, deep range of motion, big counter movements. They like to sink into movements. Maybe a lower RFD in general, eccentric RFD. Usually pretty good max force output. They're wide ISA, hip flexor dominance. They like to be in the gym, right? They're not typically, they're more contractile biased than they are elastic. So work-ons, hurdle hops, depth jumps, okay? Trying to amplify that max force expression. Hurdle hops gives us if we're using cues like being hot off the ground, we can work on that elasticity. It's giving them some form of visual cue. Depth jumps, just great for overall maximal force expression. And then med ball lateral bounds being something that, because they're restricted or constrained by the weight, they have to sink a little bit more and use a bit more max force expression versus rapid force expression. So it's something that they're good at. Moving to hybrid, the main focus being force expression, like amplifying the expression of force. So first in this block, it's early in season. So we're going to use something like a pause drop landing so we can get nice stiffness, try to improve the ability to amortize, the ability to prevent deformation in the tendons, stuff like that. So we got drop land, pause to jump. So we're taking away their reflexive capacity. Band accelerated jump, so improving that eccentric RFD. Double contact hurdle jump, hybrid, maybe they're more predisposed to elastic based qualities or muscular. So double contact is a mixture of the two. So we're working on that stiffness and more of a compliant max force output depending on hurdle height. The elastic group, looking at trying to get more deep range motion, trying to access those deeper range of motion, force them to use more contractile components rather than the elastic components. So deep tier jump squats, pentabra jumps, these long contact, ground contact, highly muscular biased movements, and then stiff pogos. From a strength component, all right, this is where we're going to start to see the division and the resource management component come in. So we have contrast sets across the board. Muscular group, half pin squat cluster. So we're really trying to improve velocity on the bar. We're restricting their depth so we can really force them. They can load up really heavy, but the emphasis is on the velocity of the bar. And then doing a compliant band assisted jump, making sure we're doing some sort of biomechanically similar motion that is something that they prefer to do. They like those deep, full muscular jumps. So we're still working those like the neuromuscular coordination of something that they're biased towards with working with something that they need to work on, if that makes sense to you. From a hybrid standpoint, force expression being that number one element, we're trying to create a lot of neuromuscular drive. So use a nice overcoming isometric split stance. All right. Maybe if we're off season, we're using more of a yielding isometric, but in this case, a low split stance overcoming ISO. Maybe it's a cluster, maybe it's just a long overcoming ISO, trying to improve um, the stiffness of that tendon. All right. And then we're pairing that with a broad jump, so an aggressive hip extension, force expressive, like horizontal force expressive movement. Elastic group, trap bar deadlift. Typically low barrier to entry, can be loaded up a lot heavier. It's more comfortable than a squat. It's still a squatting pattern, so that's where we can play a bit into that psychology, where it's like most elastic guys are going to prefer to have a trap bar. We can also put a deficit. We can put it on plates. We can do rack pulls, stuff like that. We just essentially want to get as much weight as we can bilaterally to try and improve that strength. And then we pair that with a drop jump, something stiff, expressive, something that they're good at. Secondary component, we got that upper push for both hybrid and muscular, and then we're going to flip-flop to a row as the primary secondary for the elastic, and that's just going to be a resource thing. So we have two already doing some form of bench or some form of press. So we have a row for the elastic. It just means we have less people taking up resources that are similar, right? So for muscular, we have myostatic bench working on that reflexive upper body capacity. So think about it. A lot of times we approach strategies or force expression capacity from a lower body standpoint, where it's still a total body thing to consider. Just because we're doing jumps and stuff and we're seeing that somebody might be a muscular archetype does not mean that their upper body doesn't fall in the same category. Usually it does, right? So we're going to treat the upper body the same as we are the lower body. So using a myostatic bench, amortizing in that middle position, and then a bit of a reflexive rebound. So we're going to pair that up with a Palloff rotation. So we're doing core rotation, stabilization through the midline, and shouldn't really be any interference with B1. Second superset, we now have a pull, chin up, something that muscular archetypes are typically good at. We can load this up, we can add tempo, we can add long eccentrics, get the time under tension depending on what they need, but they're usually pretty solid at this stuff, so that's a good option. And then a human force movement. Now, don't get it wrong, I tend to put human force stuff in that primer session or activation beforehand, maybe hanging on a bar, jumping over stuff, just some sort of human force. But I like putting it at the end as well. Provides a bit of challenge, kind of gets their mind clear right near the end. And it usually pairs fairly well. So chin up with a bear crawl and sit through. So secondary for hybrid, seated pin press, functional isometric. Once again, we're looking for those high force expressive outputs. So seated on a bench, maybe you load up the bar a little bit, 60-70% of your max, and then have a secondary pin above that so that we're pressing and then meeting with a functional isometric. And then we're going to pair that up with landmine oblique twist. Same sort of pattern or emphasis as the Palloff rotation, just a different implement, right? Of course, with the force vectors and where the weight is compared to the band, it's going to be a different stimulus, but the intention is rotational core stability through the midline. And we're going to accomplish that just at different methods. Plus, we're not getting in the way of that other group. Then we have suspended row, a row, different vector again in terms of where we're pulling, but it's a row, and we're just trying to get some sort of pulling volume. Then a lateral bear crawl, right? Human force, going to take place in a different location in the gym, similar stimulus. Last group, the elastics. So going with that horizontal row of choice. So once again, remember the psychological component of the elastic group is typically going to be less inclined to be in the gym. So we're giving them a bit more choice, but we're going to constrain them by adding a tempo. So they can do whatever row they want. We're getting that pull, horizontal pull, but we're going to add a specific tempo so I have a bit of controlled outcome. Going to pair that with the dumbbell pull through. Um, Similar stimulus. We're stabilizing the midline while we're trying to rotate through. Um, Different method, similar outcome. Then finishing off with barbell bench. Last two guys may not be the strongest in the barbell bench, but for some reason, every athlete seems to gravitate towards the bench. So, giving that, it's probably more of a strength than it would be other horizontal pushes. So, give them that, and a partner combative, giving them a little bit of options, compete against each other. Ideally, we're trying to get some sort of movement around in the athletic position. So, pushing against each other, pushing against a wall, or crawling, but kind of giving them a bit of free range there. The biggest takeaway here is that we're able to, and I think about the gym I work with, this tiny little broom closet with two racks, some dumbbells, barbells, a little space in a hallway, and we can accomplish all of this in one place with 25, 30 guys. So this framework is really efficient because you can plug in place based on the season phase. You can allocate volume, through your sets and reps, and you can take and put away, and you can still target all the physical qualities you need with respect to all three groups. And I think ultimately it's amazing because you look at that main strength focus. You're using a rack, you're using heavy dumbbells, using a trap bar deadlift. They can all operate at the same time with no interference, and we're still reaching the same goal. That's probably the number one, I don't know, takeaway or importance of this methodology. So, lastly, is it even worth it? All right, chatting with Joe Padula the other day, and it comes down to is it even worth it, especially with a younger demographic like high schoolers and stuff like that. I don't know. I think in the grand scheme of things, I'm a big believer that people just mostly need GPP. They mostly need to just be taught the fundamentals of strength and conditioning. However, I'm also a strong believer that if we have the capacity and the knowledge to educate the youth in a more, I don't know, specific way, then we're checking that box of being able to um, give them what they want, if you will. And we're also able to educate them on more advanced methodologies, right? We can begin to archetype. We can track them through their archetyping and see how they progress up and down in response to the type of training we're doing. I think long term, if you're working with a school, a team, or something like that, and you're going to have a long term exposure to these kids, I think you don't have to, like, if they're U12, you don't have to be doing this kind of workout with them. By no means should you. But we can begin to plug and place more regressed versions of things like this. We can begin to put them in a system or a pathway that is somewhat rigid, right? So that they can be exposed to these things. So I do think it's worth it. I think it provides a lot of information and provides the opportunity for us to push things forward and ask more questions. And I think ultimately, even if we're putting together very basic sessions for our young youth athletes, I think it's gonna check the right boxes, and it's gonna benefit everybody, especially coaches, resource management. I think it's huge. All right, thank you. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts. Follow me on Instagram and just shoot me a message, comment on this, whatever it is. I want to hear people's thoughts and if they have questions. Sometimes I only cover the things that I'm thinking about. Maybe some of this makes sense. Maybe that none of this makes sense. Maybe I'll cover a bit more on other topics. If you want to see maybe more examples of different times of the year and how this will change, just let me know. I'm happy to do it. It's free. It's just a bit of time. And looking forward to the feedback. Thank you.